Welcome back to the Art Trippin lecture series, and today we will be discussing an introduction to the Renaissance. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin lecture series.
Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin.
You've probably heard this term Renaissance before, and you may know that it means rebirth. It comes from a French word for rebirth. In Italian, this time period is called Il Rinascimento, and the Renaissance refers to a time period in Western Europe, roughly from about 1300 to 1600, that describes these intellectual, artistic, and economic changes that occur in mostly Western Europe during this time period. And we're going to see, because of these changes, really a revolution in the visual culture of this time period. We will start this series with a little bit of introduction. Then I will discuss Il Quattrocento. This is the 1400s in Italy. Following that, we will talk again about the early Renaissance, but we will look to Northern Europe. Then we will move into the Cinquecento. This is the 1500s. This is known as the High Renaissance. And of course, after that, we will again return to the High Renaissance looking at Northern Europe. So this is sort of what's in store for you in the rest of this series. So, what is the Renaissance? Let's start with some terms. We're going to hear this term Quattrocento. This refers to the 1400s or the 15th century, and this is a time period that we refer to as the early Renaissance. And this is when we see some really big changes happening in the arts. Some of the important artistic trends that we will see in the 15th century or the Quattrocento is a new attention to the human form. So we're going to see a return of classical nudity. So in classical Greece and Roman statuary, we see a lot of nudity, and we'll see that return in the 1400s. And we will see in sculpture human forms standing in a contrapposto position. In drawing and painting, we will see the discovery and codification of linear perspective and atmospheric perspective. And these will help to create the illusion of a three-dimensional space on a flat two-dimensional surface like the canvas of a painting. We will also see the use of chiaroscuro, light and dark. This is what you might have learned if you've ever taken a drawing class as tone or shading. This is when artists start to use light and dark to shape and model forms. And this all creates a greater sense of naturalism. And you remember from our last video that naturalism means that the image in the artwork sort of looks like real life. We will also see that in general, in the Renaissance, paintings have a balanced and symmetrical composition. We will also see the use of the triangular composition, and this will often be associated with the Catholic or Christian concept of the Holy Trinity. And lastly, in architecture, we will see classical forms incorporated into Renaissance architecture, and we will see again a renewed interest in triumphal arches, massive domes over cathedrals, and harmonious geometric relationships. So, for example, ancient Greek architects were all about these ratios, so that like the front of the temple might have had 6 columns and the side had 12, and the space between the columns was equal to the height of the columns, and on like this. Everything is about proportion and ratio, and we see a rebirth of that in Renaissance architecture. So let's look at one example of art to help us understand these changes that are happening in the 1400s. Here we're looking at Piero della Francesca's Resurrection from 1460. Now, what's the iconography? First of all, you gotta know about this guy, Jesus Christ, right? He's in a lot of the art during the Renaissance. So you know that eventually he is crucified, and after he's laid to rest, he, supposedly resurrects and comes back to life. So this is what we are seeing in this scene. There are these soldiers and followers of Jesus who are sitting in front of his tomb, and he has risen and he has come back to life. And here he is stepping out of the tomb. That's the basic subject matter. So how is this typical of Renaissance art? Well, first of all, we see a great deal of naturalism. It looks like real life. So let's dive a little deeper into this. What exactly in this painting is making it look like real life? Well, I think one of the obvious things are the abs. Jesus has been in the gym. He has been working on his core. We see an interest in the human body. So the artist has taken some care and some effort to depict the details of the musculature, a little bit of an attempt at the foreshortening of Jesus's leg kind of climbing up out of the tomb. You even see the wound in Jesus's side with blood dripping out of it. So there's all of this naturalism in the way the human body is depicted. You also see it in his friends who have fallen asleep outside of his tomb. Look at this guy in the kind of brown, sort of dark brown. It almost looks like he's wearing armor, but you can see his pecs and his abs and all of his muscles through his clothing. You have other figures that are twisting and leaning, bending. This one figure is bending over with his head in his hands. So all of the bodies are in these naturalistic poses and they look like real human beings, as opposed to the stiff frozen figures of medieval art or Egyptian art. We also see an attempt at kind of an illusionistic sense of space. If you look at the kind of barren trees, you'll see that as the trees move back in space, the trees are getting smaller. So the artist is using this kind of sense of scale to create the illusion of depth in this landscape. So we see a great deal of naturalism. We see an interest in accurately depicting the anatomy of the human body and the attempt on the part of the artist to create an illusionistic sense of space and to create figures that really are kind of taking up space, and we feel the weightiness of the world in these figures. So this is a great example of early Italian Renaissance art. So where did the Renaissance begin? And you might think of the Renaissance as a kind of Italian art style, but actually there are many Renaissances. Of course, we think of the Renaissance kind of beginning in places like Florence and Milan, in what is today modern day kind of northern Italy, central and northern Italy. But we will see that Renaissance ideas spread across Europe, northern Europe, in the south of Italy. There's even like sort of a different style of Renaissance art in Rome. So we will talk about the differences in this series between Italian Renaissance art, Northern Renaissance art, and we might even look at, say, the difference between Venetian Renaissance and Roman Renaissance. So although we think of the Renaissance as this kind of Italian phenomenon, it really is something that spreads all throughout Europe. Another thing I want to point out about Italy is if you look at a map of Italy from the Renaissance, you will see that our modern idea of Italy did not exist yet. I mean, Italy isn't a unified country until the 19th century, the 1800s. So what we have instead are republics and kingdoms, independent kingdoms. Venice, for example, is basically its own country, the Republic of Venice. So Italy as a modern concept didn't really exist at the time. So you have to think of these cities almost like their own little countries. Sometimes these city-states were allied with each other and sometimes they were warring with each other. So the relationships between these cities and between these neighbors was an important key factor to kind of keeping political balance and the balance of power in Italy in the Renaissance. So to review, some of the characteristics that we will see in Renaissance art include a renewed fascination with the art of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And this is when you might see the term classical art, and like classical with a capital C. This is referring to ancient Greece, specifically like, 500 BCE. But in general, we see artists in the 1400s and 1500s looking back to ancient Greece and Rome because there was a kind of flurry of archaeological discoveries that was driving this new and renewed fascination with the ancient world. There's also a kind of philosophical and education system that's developing at the time. You might read about this term humanism. You might think of humanism kind of like a general education or liberal arts studies. So back in the Middle Ages, an artist might be trained in one skill, like say stained glass making. And they would be born into that, they would become an apprentice, they would do this one skill, they would never sign an artwork, and eventually the cathedral would get built and they would pass on. In the Renaissance, we see instead of artists just having a very specific, narrow technical education, artists start to have a more well-rounded education, a liberal arts education. So artists start to study literature, history, Greek, Latin, anatomy, science, mathematics. So artists are getting a well-rounded education, and they're not just sort of art workers or cultural workers, but they're trying to achieve a new status for themselves even. So we see the renewed interest in classical Greece and Rome, and a renewed interest in the human form that's coming from this humanistic movement. An interest in accurately depicting the human body, so artists begin studying anatomy. And artists really are interested in recreating what the eye sees on the canvas, in the marble, in the bronze. So they're really trying to create an image that is mimetic of nature, or an image that looks like real life. And so to do that, they will use scientific or linear perspective. They will use atmospheric perspective. And this is like, okay, if you've ever been driving on the freeway, can you tell I live in Southern California? If you've ever been driving on the freeway and you see these mountains off in the distance, the mountains that are closer to you will be more brightly colored, and the mountains that get further away will be kind of hazy, this kind of blue-gray, and as they get further and further away, they get more and more hazy. That is something that happens that the eye sees because of sort of the atmosphere. And so artists were trying to recreate that on the canvas to create that sense of depth. We will also see artists using, as I mentioned earlier, chiaroscuro, light and dark, to shape, model, and mold forms in drawing and painting. And we will see a kind of rejection of medieval ideas in art, science, and literature. So what are these medieval ideas? In the next video, I will show you the difference between medieval art and Renaissance art. So stay tuned for more Art Trippin lecture series. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Subscribe to Art Trippin on YouTube. You can also check out Art Trippin on TikTok and Art Trippin with Prof D on Instagram. If you have any questions, please ask me questions here in the comments. And also if you have any suggestions or if there's anything that you want to see more from, let us know in the comments and we'll make some videos for you. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this has been Art Trippin.